Well, hello again, but we're going to talk, well, we could call this the literary program, aviation literary program. But I have seen, because I've got it up on my wall, a poem written by a 19-year-old pilot. He's an American who was flying for the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was born in China. His parents were missionaries. They came to the United States when the war started breaking out. It's World War II. And he was offered a scholarship because he's a good writer at Yale, but he turned it down to go to the flight school. And he went into the civilian pilot training program, and I went in it too. Of course, I went in when I was 16 years old. When they found out I was 18 years old, I didn't last very long. And anyway, his name was John Gillespie McGee. And just about, I think, any pilot, you might ask him about that, and they will know this name. And I have got a picture of him here. He's 19 years old, a fighter pilot in the Canadian RAF, and he's in Germany flying against the experienced German pilots. 19 years old, flying a fighter. And anyway, he wrote a poem, because he was a writer, and that's why he got the scholarship to Yale. And he wrote a poem that's become a classic all over the world. I think foreign pilots even have the thing framed in their homes. But I'm going to read it to you. It's called High Flight. And the guy's name was John Gillespie McGee, Jr. And what a guy, for 19 years old, a fighter pilot, flying against the experienced German Messerschmitt pilots. He wrote this poem, and 2 days later, he was killed. He sent this poem to his family 2 days before. And here it is. In fact, portions of this poem are in the Arlington National Cemetery on headstones for pilots, military men, and astronauts. So that's how popular the poem has been since 1941 when he wrote it. High Flight by John Gillespie McGee, Jr. And we had a man down at the Military Air Preservation down at Akron, Canton, and he was an ex-World War II pilot. He recited this poem at every event they had, and he's gone now. But he did a great job. And also, I might add that John Denver, remember John Denver was killed in an airplane crash. Now, John Denver was #1. His songs were #1 on many of the boards. And he had many popular songs, and he put this to music, and he sang it. Then John Denver, shortly after he sang this poem, it's on the internet, he was killed in an airplane crash. His father was a military pilot, was a fighter pilot also, and got him into flying and taught him to fly. But pilots, through the years, have always been literary. They're right. Maybe it's because you're up there alone and you're up there looking down at the poor people that don't experience what we're experiencing up here. You're flying like a bird, and the poetry comes out in pilots. I know from firsthand because I do it myself. And after I finish the poem, I'll list the number of pilots and tell you a little bit about them that were good writers. I mean, best-selling authors. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds, and wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along, and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up, up, the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace. where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God. Now that will get you, especially when I touch the face of God. When you get up high, you look around to see if you could do that yourself. And literature and pilots and flying and the military lost something when John Gillespie McGee, at the age of 19 years old, who wrote that poem, was killed in England flying against the Nazis. 19 years old. Now, if we can, we'll try to put this picture on for you. He was flying the Spitfire fighter, which was one of the greatest fighting airplanes ever built. And the British, it was built by the British designers and aircraft builders, and one of the finest fighter airplanes. And it actually really took the Messerschmitt on every battle and won. And the Messerschmitt was a marvelous airplane in itself. And that was the leading airplane during the World War II. Now, some of the pilots, well, Charles Lindbergh leads the group. Charles Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy, was the first man in 1925, I believe it was, the year I was born, to fly the Atlantic Ocean by himself. So he's been a legend ever since. Lucky Lindy, they called him. He also was he traveled the world. He wrote books, and he and his wife flew around the world. And he was instrumental in flying a lot of the routes that the airlines fly today. And the aircraft manufacturers, they came up with a new airplane. They'd always call Lindbergh in to test it. When the war broke out, in fact, he warned the United States years before the war that Germany is way ahead in building airplanes, and Germany is a real threat to the world. And nobody listened to him. In fact, President Roosevelt got mad at him because he said that. So he wanted to go back. In fact, Lindbergh was a military-trained pilot, so he was in the reserves. And Roosevelt refused to bring him back into the military because he thought that he should never have said that before the war. So, but Lindbergh was working for Lockheed Aircraft, and they came up with the tremendous airplane called the P-38 Lightning, a fighter airplane with 2 booms and 2 engines. And he went to work with during the war against the Roosevelt, the president, as a consultant to the Army Air Corps. And he would teach the pilots how to get more range, how to get more performance out of the pilots. And he actually, in the South Pacific, went on fighter missions. And this has never been told, but it's kept very secret by the politicians, that he shot down 5 enemy airplanes when he was a civilian, which was supposed to be against the Articles of War. But anyway, he was an inspiration to these people. And that's Charles Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy. And the other one was, now I'm going to pronounce Ernest K. Gann. Now, Ernest K. Gann was really, he was a movie producer, and then he had to quit doing that, but he's also had an airplane and was flying on his own. So he got into the Air Force, Army Air Corps, and he became a pilot there. Then when the war was over, he became a pilot with American Airlines, an airline pilot. And he wrote books on the side. And one of them was The High and the Mighty, which became in fact, it won an Academy Award. Is a story of an airplane. Actually, John Wayne had the lead, and he was the captain flying the airplane. The airplane leaving Hawaii, heading for California. Something happened with the airplane that made it almost uncontrollable. And he fought the controls and he brought the airplane in safely to San Francisco. So it really happened. And that made John Wayne's career, not the horses and the cowboy stuff he did, but the high and the mighty. And it also told about all the people in the airplane and their problems and their history and their stories and all that. And there's another famous pilot, and he was lost in 1944. Well, he's famous in pilot circles. And his name was Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I think I pronounced the last name right, but he was born of an aristocratic family in France. And he was also a writer, and he's also a pilot. When the war broke out, he flew with the French resistance. Then he flew with the United States Air Corps, and he wrote the movie, well, it was the book then, The Little Prince. And probably you younger people remember that. It was a bestseller. He also wrote Wind, Sand, and Storms, and poems and everything else. And he was an active fighter pilot in the French resistance during World War II. And he took off in a P-38 on a reconnaissance mission. He was never heard of again. And that's been a mystery for about 70 or 80 years, that whatever happened to Saint-Exupéry, because he was so well known. His books are still in print. And 1998, there was a French fisherman brought his net up, and there was a silver bracelet in there with his initials on it. So finally, in 1998, they find out what happened to him. He probably got shot down while he's on this reconnaissance mission. Now, once again, pilots, they got a lot of time, first of all. Sitting in a pilot's lounge, you can only drink so much coffee. You can only tell so many stories everybody's heard. You can only sleep so much. So what do? You pick up pencil and paper and start writing. And there are articles all the time written by pilots, books written by pilots. And I just finished a book called The Lonely Eagles. And this book grabbed me. And of course, I've always been interested in this because, I'll tell you later why. Anyway, it was the story of the African-American pilots, the Tuskegee Airmen they called them, flying in World War II. And they wanted to fly, but of course they couldn't get into the military to fly airplanes. Eleanor Roosevelt went down to Tuskegee, the airport there, and she went for a ride with several of those pilots. In a Piper Cub, when she got down on the ground, she immediately went onto the phone to President Truman and said, "Get these guys into flying." Now it was Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt was the one that went down, and she got on the president then, and he issued the executive order that established the Tuskegee Airmen down in Tuskegee Airmen. And they trained fighter pilots, black fighter pilots, with flying P-40s, P-51s, and B-25s. And they were just tremendous. There was never an airplane, a bomber, that was escorted by these guys. They always had fighter escorts later on in the war to protect the bombers against the enemy fighters. And they said they called them the Tuskegee Airmen. If they were flying escort, a bomber was never shot down. They were ferocious, good pilots. Many of them stayed in the military. One of them, Chappie James, was finally became a four-star general and was head of the fighter force in the whole United States Air Corps. He died some years ago. But this story of these men and the harassment they felt, they had to fight two wars, one at home and then in the airplanes also. They were highly decorated. I just finished the book yesterday, and it's called The Lonely Eagles. Later on, there were units of bombers, the B-17s, B-24s, that would not fly a mission, which was against the Articles of War, unless the Tuskegee Airmen were escorting them. That was a proudful thing. And just the last week, down at the in Colorado Springs at the Air Force Academy, there's a big airport, and they named the airport after General Benjamin Davis. And who was General Benjamin Davis? He was a West Point graduate, became a fighter pilot, and he was the commander of the Tuskegee Airmen. And this book is really inspiring. And it's going to be a good one. It was written by a man who was not a Tuskegee Airman, but he knew all about them, went into the pictures in that book. I highly recommend it. Go to the library, get it out. The Lonely Eagles. There were so many other books written. And I've tried to be a pilot myself all my life. That's about all I could ever read about these guys. And one was Fly for Your Life. And it told the story of another pilot with the British RAF. And he became a flight marshal in the British RAF. He flew a Spitfire, he flew everything. And it was just grabbing just to read that story about everything that this man did, how he was shot down, came back, how he escaped from being a prisoner, and how he was decorated during the war. I'm not trying to glorify war or anything like that, but it's just that the men that go there, that fly, and what they do, the bravery, and there's another book called, I don't know if I ever told you about this, called, I use it in my talks. My talk is the American Soldier, but I talk about the bridges of Toko-Ri. The bridges of Toko-Ri were a series of bridges in North Korea, heavily defended by the Chinese and by the North Koreans. And they didn't want them attacked, so there was no way we could attack, even from the ground, because it was so heavily defended. They decided, the aircraft carriers, to go in there, pilots from the carriers, to go in, attack it. And it was a mistake because some were shot down, some were captured. But the story was told by a writer who was also Pulitzer Prize. Okay, I had tongue-tied there for a minute. And thank you, Emily. And James Missioner. And he heard of the story about the attack on the bridges of Toko-Ri. So he really put his book focused on the pilots, their bravery, their character, the young pilots, the older pilots that were called in from World War II. And then the commanders decided the only way they could take those bridges out, which had to be taken out, was at night. So the aircraft carrier pilots were launched. And then the commander of the aircraft carrier and the air wing commander were pacing the bridge. They're really worried about their pilots, if this is going to be a successful mission. And the commander of the aircraft carrier said, "Where do we find such men?" And that became a phrase of President Reagan. When he would give a talk somewhere, honoring, for example, those who fell on D-Day, and he would come up with that phrase after the ceremony, when there were a lot of people around, he'd say, "Where do we find such men?" And now he would say, "Where do we find such men and women?" Because now we've got women fighter pilots. Women fly as airline pilots, flying air transports. So, as I go through a lot of this stuff, I come up with stories and books that I just can't put them down. And the other one was about an American pilot who also went through the same school that John Gillespie McGee did. Well, maybe next week I'll have some more stories for you. And thanks for being with us.